I was not surprised by Peter Magyar's victory and the fact that Tisza party won. I was surprised by the magnitude of the victory. This is a whole-scale popular rejection of 16 years of Orban government. Mr. Magyar is the former husband of the former justice minister of Hungary. And it was quite interesting is that the way that he rose to prominence, or about 2 years ago, was that he gave an interview on the back of a major scandal that happened in Hungarian political life. And one of the things that he did in this interview was actually criticize the government's treatment of his ex-wife. So if we see this kind of string of defections from Orban's party, we could see the entire party structure collapse. This is a possibility, particularly because of how many, let's say, skeletons are in the closet and how much material there is to be leaked.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Aron Rimanyi again. He's an associate at Training the Street, where he leads financial valuation and accounting training for investment banks, private equity, and consulting firms. Last time we spoke about what could happen in the elections in Hungary, in the parliamentary elections in Hungary. And today we are speaking one day after the results are out. And it's been a landslide win for Peter Magyar. So, Aron, first of all, thank you for speaking to Fair Observer. And
thanks,
secondly,
great to be back.
Yes, and lovely to have you back. People really enjoyed your analysis. But secondly, can you just tell us briefly about the election results?
Right. So yesterday, Sunday, election day, was a pivotal moment in modern Hungarian history. According to the current exit results, the main opposition party, Tisza party, which I'll remind you is a relatively new party, it came on the Hungarian political scene about 2 years ago, won a landslide political victory in this election. They are on track as results, the final results are being counted. They are on track to win a 2/3 majority in the Hungarian parliament. So at least 136 seats out of 199 available seats in the Hungarian parliament. They did this with, just let me make sure I got my facts correct, 52.4% of the popular vote, it looks like. So slightly larger portion of seats in the parliament than their popular vote. But regardless, this is a landslide victory. And it is something that the polls leading up to the election had relatively accurately predicted, but nonetheless, the polls that were aligned with the government had not predicted. So this is a major upset and a major defeat for Fidesz and the current governing party.
Right, and the last time we spoke, you were explaining in detail how Peter Magyar was once an insider of the Fidesz party, and then he broke off, and then he started Tisza party. But I want our viewers to know that you were born in Hungary, you are Hungarian by origin. So I just want to ask you, you've seen Viktor Orban in Hungary for the last 16 years. Now you're going to have a new face, Peter Magyar. Did the results surprise you?
So I was not surprised by Peter Magyar's victory and the fact that Tisza party won. I was surprised by the magnitude of the victory. This is a whole-scale popular rejection of 16 years of Orban government. And one of the other things, if you're related to my personal experience, young people like me, throughout the majority of our life since we were 18, the Orban government is the only government that we have known, right? So the political system and the political culture in Hungary has been intensely defined by the Fidesz party, and with it, the single larger than life character of the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. So this is a tremendous change. And in fact, one of the main reasons that the Tisza party won over Orban was the fact that young people got out to vote. And the vote of the young people was a determining factor in this election yesterday.
Well, you say that young people were the determining factor, but can you explain that more? And I don't want to get into the demographics of who voted and how they voted, but what did they vote on? Like, what were the key issues in this election that ultimately cemented Viktor Orban's defeat?
Sure. So let's talk about what, in my view, are the key determining factors of the vote result that we saw yesterday. I would say that, kind of harkening back to our talk a couple of weeks ago, the economy is a primary factor here, right? And I don't want to get too deep into analyzing Hungary's economy. We can do that on a different day. But it was quite clear in the last 4 or 5 years that the economic system that Viktor Orban and his Fidesz government had put into place ran out of steam. It was an economic system, a pro-cyclical system that worked in the good years, right? So basically up until 2020 and COVID. But it quite readily turned out that after EU funds dried up around in 2022, and when the global economy started turning bit bad. Starting in 2020, this was a system that essentially ran out of steam. So Hungary had the largest inflation rate of any EU country in 2022 and 23. Hungary is quite clear now is quite stuck in the middle income trap. So the total factor of productivity of the country is quite low, which means that although cost of living is rising, wages are not improving. And you see that a lot of the kind of economic engines of the country have run out of steam. So this, in my opinion, kind of economist trained, right? So I've maybe over-indexed on these economic factors, but when they come home to roost, it's only a matter of time, until people start voting with their wallets. So this is the first reason. And then secondly, I think I want to get a bit more into actually analyzing the campaigns, right? So Peter Magyar, over the past 2 years, he leads a new party, the Tisza party, came onto the political scene 2 years ago. He led a very different kind of campaign than any party in modern Hungarian history. It was a grassroots campaign. Peter Magyar, he did over a dozen tours of the country where he would speak from everywhere from large towns to the smallest of villages. He went to villages of 100 people, 200 people that no politician had really ever visited in the past 30 years. He led a local grassroots movement of, small local communities that supported his party. In the lead up to the election in the past 3 weeks, he led an average of 5 or 6 rallies a day. So this is a very kind of direct speaking to the people, speaking to millions of people over the course of 2 years, direct grassroots campaign, and the style of political communication that most people are not used to, and none of the previous parties, especially Fidesz party, had adopted. So I think that's one of the main reasons, dynamic campaigning on the part of Tisza party. And then thirdly, I would say that there were several mistakes that were made by Orbán's party, Fidesz. It seemed that, especially in the kind of months and weeks leading up to the election, the political communication of Fidesz was centered around a couple easy messages. The primary of this being laying a lot of blame on Ukraine and the Ukrainian government and treating Ukraine as a security threat to Hungary. And these were messages that I think they thought understand, but they were in a way too easy and not nuanced enough. And a lot of people felt that, okay, despite maybe me agreeing with the security rhetoric of the government, the everyday cost of living that is prioritized by Peter Magyar is a more important consideration. So I think the kind of campaign messaging of Fidesz. And also, it was quite hard for me sometimes to understand why the Fidesz government almost made everything a communications issue. So if there were issues that arose, say, over the past year that Peter Magyar made into campaign points, instead of seeking tangible solutions via policy or via economic policy to those issues, the Fidesz government always just seemed to have the idea of, if we spin this in the right way or couch it in the right political messaging, then we can get people on our side. So in a way, in my opinion, they were a bit short on the governing side and on the policy side and treated everything as a communications issue and simplified things into messages that were a bit not nuanced enough. And then fourthly, I would say that this is something that a lot of Western analysts tend to ignore, is that in the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to the elections, there were a series of, let's say, leaks, right, or heavily watched interviews by people who came forward, who had been affiliated with Orban government or had been state functionaries, who had been serving in some civil service capacity, who came forward and said, let me show you how things are on the inside. So one of the most prominent of these was a captain of the Hungarian military who had actually been the face of the PR recruitment campaign to get people to join the military, who came forward, essentially broke ranks and say, let me tell you how bad things are in the military, chronically underfunded, and actually most of the military doesn't support the government. So these kinds of, let's say, leaks or messages from the inside that came forward in the weeks leading up to the election truly had a massive impact on people's perceptions.
Right. Can you tell us more on that? Because there were also multiple reports and allegations of massive corruption in the Orban government. And that was one of the sticking points for people, especially the young people, when they voted this time.
Right. Absolutely. So corruption, I think, is nothing new, especially the perception of corruption has been endemic to the Orban government over 16 years. Peter Magyar was probably best able to weaponize this as a rhetorical tool and really shed light on this in a way that people resonated with, right? So I think that is nothing new. What is kind of new is the fact that several new pieces of information came to light. So one of the leaks that came forward in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign is the fact that one of the people who worked, he was actually a captain level commander in the sort of the equivalent of the FBI, so Department of Investigations, which is of course a civil service organ of the Hungarian government. He came forward and said that he had been instructed kind of indirectly to prosecute a case or look into or investigate a case that looked like he was being told to investigate actually the Tisza party. So it was the narrative that was built around this, which in my opinion seems quite correct, is that the organs of the state and the investigative agencies of the state were being used to essentially discredit and investigate a rival political party, right? So this is, you could say it's corruption, but really it's state capture, right? Organs of the state being used in a partisan tool, right? And these kinds of moves, I think, crossed the pale for a lot of people and said, okay, this is a step too far in democratic backsliding.
Right. Aaron, I still want to talk about Viktor Orban's campaign before I move on to Peter Magyar, because one thing that really struck out for me was US Vice President J.D. Vance in Hungary almost batting for Viktor Orban and even telling him that he had the blessings of US President Donald Trump. That was very strange. How did it not count for election meddling, and did it even have any sway? Did it impact voters?
Okay, let me give you my perspective on this, which might be sort of a surprising one to a lot of American listeners here. Is I think the J.D. Vance visit in the week leading up to the election was essentially a non-event. If I had to pinpoint, the 5 most important events of the campaign in the weeks leading up to the election, this would not be even in the top 5. And so there's several reasons for this. Firstly, again, might be quite difficult for American listeners to fathom, but J.D. Vance is not a well-known figure in Eastern Europe, including in Hungary. He has very low name recognition. I don't think there's polling around this, but I would venture to say that the majority of Hungarians of either party might not even know who he is, right? So that's the first thing. Secondly, when he actually came to Budapest, I think it was glaringly apparent in the eyes of most observers of this event that he came empty-handed, right? He came with a very clear political endorsement, which was communication, but he didn't come with a entourage of American companies that were ready to sign MOUs or invest in Hungary, right? And this strikes a chord, right? So what this means is actually it ties into the Orban government's rhetoric for the past, say, 18 months, essentially from the beginning of the Trump campaign to all the way through the first year of the Trump presidency. Orban had been communicating very clearly that the Trump presidency will be a boon. It will be fantastically beneficial to Hungary in very direct ways, right? You could say in some ways, actually, Orban, with his endorsement of Trump, put everything online to say that, okay, we need a Trump presidency because it will be wonderful for Hungary. And while a lot of Orban supporters were very happy when Trump got elected, over the past year, I think many of them have been quite disappointed that even though Orban has a friend in the White House on a personal level, this has not yielded any tangible effect or positive impact on the ground for the everyday lives of Hungarians. There's not extra American investment or FDI, so to speak, right? And the Vance visit was yet again an iteration of this, is that the Americans come with words of support and friendliness to Viktor Orban, but they come empty-handed and in no way will this impact the lives of everyday people. So that's the second reason why this did not have an impact. The third one is simply the fact that Viktor Orban had been campaigning, or let's say lobbying, extremely heavily to get a direct visit from President Trump. Essentially, since the visit of Viktor Orban to the White House in last October, all the way to now, over several months, this has been an intense lobbying effort on the part of the Hungarian government to get Trump himself to come. And the fact that, despite all the words of friendliness and friendship between these two leaders, Orban was not able to bring Mr. Trump to come to Budapest, and we had to make do with Mr. Vance instead. I think it was, in a way, a kind of disappointment for a lot of Fidesz voters to say maybe Mr. Orban doesn't have the clout that he quite claims to have in the White House.
Right. Aaron, there's some very interesting parallels that I can draw from this, what you just told me about how things were in Hungary and even in India, because here the right wing was very jubilant when Donald Trump won and came to the White House, because they thought he would rekindle ties with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Instead, he hit India with the highest tariffs and then sanctions for buying Russian oil. And then now there's a clear shift in the average Indian towards the Trump administration, very much like how you've explained how the Hungarians are now viewing Trump after a year in office. And of course, J.D. Vance's visit in India was also mired by a major terror attack in the northern part of the country. So people have that bitter taste, and I can kind of sense it from you how you're talking about Hungary, because that was in the election time. But I want to now talk about Peter Magyar, because the last time we spoke, you explained how he's a former insider of the Fidesz party. So how will he be any different from Orban?
So just to give a bit of context here for those who didn't watch our previous conversation, right? So Mr. Magyar is the former husband of the former justice minister of Hungary. And it was quite interesting is that the way that he rose to prominence, or about 2 years ago, was that he gave an interview on the back of a major scandal that happened in Hungarian political life. And one of the things that he did in this interview was actually criticize the government's treatment of his ex-wife. They were already divorced by that time, but he said, one of the ways that we can see that something is rotten in the government apparatus is that they are laying blame on individual ministers and kind of looking for scapegoats like my ex-wife. Right? So his political affiliation and past with the Fidesz party served very much as a launching point for him to gain political attention within Hungary, which then created a platform for him to create a new party. So yes, he does have that background, and he has never denied that background. But I would say that in the past 2 years, he has broken extremely cleanly with that background, and said that, in fact, the fact that he was part of that system allows him to come forward and speak in a much more honest and truthful and revelatory way about the shortcomings of that system, right? So that has been actually one of the ways that he's been able to boost his campaign, saying, let me tell you how it is from the inside because I used to be part of it, which has boosted the political communication. When you asked about how will he be different, right? So I think, as we discussed last time, a lot of the campaign has been around everyday issues facing Hungarians, right? So what is the reality of life on the ground? So this is not just perceived corruption on the part of elites, but this is, the fact that your wages are no longer able to keep up with standard of living and inflation is too high, right? So those, or that the Hungarian economy is stuck in a way that our neighbors are roaring past us in their economic performance, right? So things that are quite easy for most people to understand, and these are messages that resonate with a lot of the Hungarian public. And in this way, he's actually not commented or even sought to avoid commenting on a lot of the foreign policy issues which have defined Mr. Orbán's and Fidesz's campaign. The Fidesz campaign was very heavily leaning into anti-Ukrainian rhetoric, saying Ukraine is a security threat, stressing how Mr. Orbán has strong friendly relationships, even on a personal level, with some of the most powerful leaders in the world, right? So this was very much what is Hungary's place in the world and what is Hungary's connections to the rest of the world? That was a major tone of Fidesz's campaign. And by contrast, Mr. Magyar and Tisa's campaign was much more focused on everyday issues that impact the daily lives of most Hungarians. Right. And so you saw a very different tone among the two camps. And it seemed like the latter, Tisa's campaign, resonated more with most people. Now, if we had to go to address kind of the heart of your question, if we had to go into the kind of nitty-gritty of what will, say, the foreign policy towards Ukraine or the EU or Russia look like of the...
We might as well get into it. We might as well,
right,
now that you brought it up, let's get into the good stuff, the geopolitical stuff. What's Peter Magyar's position going to be when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to the EU?
Sure. Yeah. So firstly, on the EU, Mr. Magyar will, I think it's quite confident we can say, have a much more pro-EU position, at least rhetorically speaking, right? And he has already said that Hungary will join various EU agencies that it's not already a part of, and we can also count on Mr. Magyar not vetoing, say, aid packages to Ukraine in the way that Mr. Orban has done a few times, right? So I think in that sense, much more going along with the EU party line. By the way, I think it's safe to say that this is not a terribly controversial issue in Hungary. The vast majority of the Hungarian public is actually pro-European, right? So this is actually has more of a social consensus. This pro-European orientation has more of a social consensus around it than you would think just by listening to an Orban speech, for example. So much more pro-EU and much more towing the EU line when it comes to policy on Ukraine. However, and this is a key distinction, Mr. Magyar has made clear that some aspects of the previous foreign policy on Ukraine will be kept. So, for example, just like before, Hungary will not export arms to Ukraine, right? And so lethal military material will not be sent to Ukraine, right? So some of those aspects will be kept. On the Russia front, Mr. Magyar will try to distance himself as much as possible, in my opinion, from the foreign policy or the perceived foreign policy of the Orban government of being pro-Russia, pro-Putin, and so forth. Again, this is more, in some cases, this is more of a perception than a reality, but he will seek to distance himself as much as possible from that. So we will see, for example, in my opinion, a diversification of Hungary's energy sources, particularly import of Russian hydrocarbons will be cut down, and we'll see diversification to, say, importing more hydrocarbons from the United States, right? So, which in my opinion is actually quite beneficial for the country. And you will certainly see on a high-level diplomatic dialogue, you will see a much more cold, potentially even neutral attitude towards Russia than, say, the more collegiate types of diplomatic communication that the Orban government has had with Moscow.
Right. Well, Aaron, you're in the United States, and I want you to give us an insight into how to understand and read Hungary's political spectrum. And here I want you to talk about Magyar's or policies that we can expect from Magyar's government, because the Tisza party is a center-right party, and that is Peter Magyar's party. And then you've got Fidesz under Viktor Orban, which was considered hard right. So it looks like Hungarians didn't have an option. They just had two right-wing parties running for government. How different are their policies going to even be if they're both on the same political spectrum? Ideologically, of course.
Okay. Couple comments on this, because if you actually look at policies on the ground, you either look at the policies that Fidesz has implemented over the past 16 years, or if you read the quite detailed program that the Tisza party has published over what they intend to do now that they will rise into government, it's very hard to cast those policies onto a clear left-right spectrum. Actually, either of them, right? So while I think Mr. Orban would definitely say that he identifies with the right ideologically speaking, a lot of his social and economic policies are more difficult to categorize onto that spectrum, right? Mr. Magyar, if you asked him, kind of what ideology, where do you fall on the ideology spectrum, he would stress the fact that his Tisza party is a big tent opposition party. And they are more focused on practical improvements in the everyday lives of people, which oftentimes tend to be rather technical or almost bureaucratic improvements, rather than focusing on heavy ideological posturing, right? So, I don't want to speak for him. I, of course, do not speak for anyone in any way, but he might reject the labeling of, say, he's a right-wing leader. That's definitely not the label under which he would seek to start his term as prime minister. But I think what you are kind of pointing to is the fact that certainly there is let's say, the new parliament will be composed of a smaller number of parties than we've previously seen in prior Hungarian parliaments, right? So there will be the Tisza party with a 2/3 majority. There will be Fidesz, Orbán's party, in opposition as the largest opposition party. And there will be one very small far-right party with, it looks like, about 6 seats. Now, so 3 parties in parliament, of which the vast majority of seats are by 2 of them, with one with a 2/3 majority. So this is a more concentrated layout of the Hungarian parliament than we've really seen before. This is absolutely true. However, I think that the way that we need to interpret the results of the Hungarian election and the massive mandate that the Tisza party has gotten is not just that it's a repudiation of the Orban government, it certainly is, but it is also a repudiation of all the legacy opposition parties which have dominated kind of the Hungarian opposition spectrum, the anti-Orban spectrum in the past, right? So you've seen legacy parties which previously, were quite popular and got into parliament with, over a dozen seats. You've seen them get less than 1% of the vote yesterday. Right, so this is a wholesale rejection, not just of the Orban government, it's a wholesale rejection of all the classic opposition parties. And you've seen the opposition vote of all stripes and of all banners, left-wingers and right-wingers alike, who are unhappy with the Orban government, unite under the banner of Peter Magyar. And I think Peter Magyar is very much aware of the fact that he represents an extremely broad and extremely varied spectrum of voters. 3.1, 3.2 million voters of all different political affiliations and ideologies who voted for him yesterday. And he has to govern in such a way that he makes all of these people happy and fulfills his promises, which again, I stress, are much more practical than they are ideological.
Right. And the interesting part here is that Peter Magyar started this party just 2 years ago. So he's actually coming into forming his government with a clean slate, unlike Viktor Orban, who had been in power for 16 years. So I want to end this discussion on Orban because he was, as you rightfully said, most Hungarians, at least young Hungarians, have only seen him. It's not just Hungarians who've only seen him. The entire world kind of only knows Viktor Orban. We don't know Peter Magyar that much. So for the love of politics and the game, Viktor Orban's only 62 years old. I mean, you've got world leaders who are much older than that. So are you saying that it's time up for Orban? Do you think his political career is over? Or do you think he could spring back 4 years later?
This is difficult to say. And I feel that our answers to this collectively will heavily have to be informed by what happens in the next 3 weeks. So we're entering the interregnum, let's say, right, in which for the next 3-4 weeks, it's actually quite, there's some flexibility in that. There is some time until the next government is formed, right? And during these couple of weeks, Viktor Orban is still in power, still with the same 2/3 majority that he had before, right? And so a lot will depend upon what happens in these next 3 weeks. I can imagine a wide variety of outcomes. So without speculating, let me just kind of outline the variety of outcomes that is possible. One of them is that the Fidesz party, Mr. Orban's party, completely dissolves, right? In a way, I think they had a strong inertia from being in power for so long, right? And the fact that they were in power and were able to craft institutions around that power made it so that there was nothing to question. And in my opinion, it was a little bit of a too centralized party around the figure of the prime minister. Now that that mirage of invincibility is broken, quite comprehensively, it is possible that the party will fracture into different interest groups. It is possible that we will see, just as in the weeks leading up to the election, we will see more whistleblowers come forward. People who within the party try to defend their own interests by exposing others. Right. So if we see this kind of string of defections from Orban's party, we could see the entire party structure collapse. This is a possibility, particularly because of how many, let's say, skeletons are in the closet and how much material there is to be leaked. Right? I mean, there's quite a bit of information that could be uncovered by party insiders. So that is one possibility, is the complete collapse of the Fidesz party. Then the other end of the spectrum is that the party discipline of Fidesz maintains. Orban is able to keep a strong grasp over his own party. He's able to leverage the different agencies in which he's appointed heads over the past 16 years, who will continue to be heads of those agencies and organs, including the courts. He's able to leverage that almost as a diversified network of power to keep him in the prominence of politics and serve as a way to dig his heels in and resist everything that Peter Magyar does over the next 4 years. So in that sense, we might see a kind of trench warfare where he is effectively in opposition, but maintains party discipline and resists as much as he's possible the different policies of the next Hungarian government. So these are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. It's very hard to say which one will end up or maybe somewhere in the middle. I am more of the opinion that the Fidesz party and its institutions and its culture of loyalty and its culture of cohesiveness were very much dependent upon them being in power. And the moment that mirage of invincibility is broken, major rifts and major kind of cracks in the party will start emerging. Whether that will lead to a complete collapse of the party and, in fact, a position where Mr. Orban has to resign as president of the party, that I don't know. That remains to be seen. But I think we will see that the Fidesz party was much more brittle than a lot of people may have imagined at the time that they were in power.
Brilliant. Aaron, thank you very much for speaking to Fair Observer and for simplifying what's happened in Hungary, because these elections are really important, because we could see a totally different Hungary, we could see a totally different EU, we could see different things happening when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war. So brilliant, as always. Thank you very much, Aaron.
Before we conclude, let me just put one word out here, is that as I was observing the election results roll in yesterday, it was quite inspiring for me to see, well, one, the high turnout, 80% turnout, that's right. Remarkable, even in a European context, let alone an American context, right? So high participation among, fellow Hungarian citizens of mine who came out in vast numbers, and also the participation of young people. Right. So I think young people were more engaged and more motivated in this campaign than ever. So let me end with a kind of word of congratulations and optimism for the future around the fact that, this new Hungary that we will build together and that hopefully I can help my Hungarian compatriots build, will be built with, especially the help of young people who look forward to the next 4 years.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much for having me.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.